Welcome to our remote access program. We will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon and welcome to Remote Access, a nation divided, Palestinian views on war and peace with Israel. For those who are joining for the first time, Access is the young professional division of AJC, whose mission is to combat anti-Semitism, promote Israel's place in the world, and to promote democratic values. As the now generation of leadership, Access has made it a priority to promote change through relationship building. Access leaders, as recently as this week, continue to meet with civic leaders from across the Middle East, North Africa, Israel, and the West Bank. Infusing multiple viewpoints is essential in ensuring effective advocacy. And today is an extraordinary example of how AJC and Access explore various lenses in complex geopolitical landscapes. As we continue to engage in dialogue and advocacy with our partners on the ground in the Middle East, we acknowledge that there are many conversations to be had, and the voices represented in today's conversation are just the beginning of our continued efforts within Access and AJC. We also acknowledge the incredible risk that researchers take to acquire this crucial data. Today, our goal is not to explore detailed policy solutions to the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Instead, our goal is to continue to inform our outlook by learning from our speakers' seminal research on this topic. I'm delighted to introduce our expert for this session. David Pollock, the Bernstein Fellow and Director of Project Fikra at the Washington Institute, served previously as the Senior Advisor for the broader Middle East at the State Department, with a focus on women's rights. He also helped launch the department's Iraqi Women Democracy Initiative and the U.S.-Afghan Women's Council, working directly with advocates across the Middle East. Pollock has served as a visiting lecturer at Harvard University and as an assistant professor at George Washington University. Fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and several other languages, he has authored books and articles on a wide range of regional issues. Without further ado, I'll now hand it over to Maggie Fredman, Associate Director of Global Young Leadership for AJC, to moderate our conversation. Maggie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dana, for that perfect segue into our conversation today. And thank you, David, for joining us for this very important discussion. We are so thrilled to have you, and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone that you can submit questions for David using the Q&A function on your screen. David and I will be in conversation, and then we will open it up to questions. So please submit questions throughout. And with that, let's jump in.
Okay.
Particularly, I think today, on the heels of President Trump's announcement this morning of a normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE, and his request to freeze annexation or intended annexation plans within the West Bank, our conversation could not be more timely.
Yeah, right.
This is certainly a moment to really have a grasp of Palestinian public opinion and how it informs these matters. So thank you, and we are very happy to jump into your really seminal work.
Okay, great.
So with that, for those who have not yet read David's piece, which was published through the Washington Institute and is available there, your research represents an enormous undertaking. It is 10 years worth of surveying, 1,500 Palestinians interviewed, surveying done across the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. It is really, really quite an undertaking. So give us a sense of how did a study of this magnitude come into being? And from a very technical sense, how were you able to capture such an extensive survey of Palestinian opinion?
Okay, great. Thanks again. I'll try to be very brief. But as you say, it's a big project. It's kind of a long story. So the background for me personally was that doing surveys, public opinion polls in the Middle East, including among Palestinians and Israelis and many other places in the region, that was my job in the US government for quite a while back in from the mid 1980s until the late 1990s. And I was in that capacity. I was one of the pioneers of doing political opinion polls in the Middle East. And Israel, of course, was pretty familiar with that. And there are lots of polls in Israel that you can read about every day. But in Arab countries and other Middle East countries like Turkey or Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan, or further afield in the Muslim world, this kind of polling was actually very, very rare. It was kind of a taboo in many places. And it was my job to try and get around that taboo and find ways to do real surveys, even in places like the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or, you know, Saudi Arabia or Syria or all kinds of rather remote and closed societies. And the way I did that, to make a long story short, was to, first of all, work with local contractors all the time. I don't take an American team out into the field and go around and ask questions. I hire local experts, qualified professionals in each place to do this work. And so when it comes to Palestinian public opinion polls, I work with Palestinians. I work with, in fact, I help train many of the Palestinian pollsters that are still doing very good professional work all the time out there. And that really started in 1993, 94, right after the first Oslo agreements, when the US government sent me out to the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem to work with Palestinian survey research professionals and help stand up a really good capability to do this kind of work. And I'm still working now, what is it, more than 25 years later, I'm still working with a lot of the same Palestinian colleagues that I started with way back in the early 1990s. So the way we do it is, first of all of these surveys are done face-to-face. We don't use telephone surveys or online surveys or any other shortcuts that are very commonly used in the United States or in Europe or some other places, including in Israel. We don't do that because it turns out that, strangely enough, to our sensibilities, I think, in Arab culture, and I think Middle Eastern culture more generally, except for Israel, people are more inclined to talk to a stranger about sensitive political subjects in person than they are over the phone or online. As I said, it might sound a little strange to us because in person it seems like you're actually, you know, right there in front of somebody else, a complete stranger, and opening up your heart about really tough issues. But in Palestinian and other Arab societies, people are very afraid, generally, with good reason, that if they talk about that to a stranger on the telephone or online, it's going to be wiretapped or recorded or somehow used against them. And they're very suspicious of that. So when you get an anonymous phone call, you just don't respond usually. And that means that the surveys are really a pretty major effort. You have to literally go around door to door, and that's what we do. And we do it using standard geographic probability procedures. So these are true random samples. And it takes a few weeks usually to interview 1,000 or 1,500 sometimes respondents in each survey. That gives you a real good statistical cross-section of the whole population. But it's worth it because once we're done, we have what I think everybody or almost everybody would acknowledge are really credible results about even the most controversial, the hottest political and other issues of the day.
So I want to touch on one of the kind of tenets of the actual survey
Sure.
that you built in, which I think, again, continues to impress me, the extensive nature of it. You made the conscious decision to survey Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem.
Right.
So for those who are joining us who have not had the opportunity to read your study in full, can you give us some highlights of differences in public opinion
Sure.
that you found between the three?
Right, right. Yeah, well, you're raising I think, thanks for that. It's a really important question that you're raising, because a lot of people, including some other pollsters who work in this area, tend to lump all of the Palestinians together. And that's increasingly, I think, misleading, because these populations of Palestinians, especially in the last 15 years, are living under very, very different conditions in each place. And therefore, their attitudes are quite likely to be pretty different, and they shouldn't be lumped together. We need to look separately at what the Palestinians, about 350,000 of them in East Jerusalem, think, what the Palestinians, about 2 million or so, a little over that, in the West Bank think, and what the Palestinians, again, about 2 million in Gaza think. Because the ones in Gaza, and I'm sure all of you know this already, have been living under Hamas rule since 2006 or 2007, when Hamas took over by force and kicked the Fatah people out of Gaza. And they have a very different relationship with Israel and with their own rulers, their own leaders. The Israelis are out of Gaza. They pulled out in 2005, so you don't have issues of settlements. You don't have much contact with Israel or Israelis at all among the people in Gaza. And you have rule by one Palestinian faction, Hamas, which is very belligerent, at least, you know, in its ideology, rejects peace with Israel altogether, is Islamist, and exercises a very repressive monopoly of power in the Gaza Strip. Now, on the West Bank, you have a very different situation. You have much more contact with Israelis, at least with settlers and soldiers. You have a different government in place, the Palestinian Authority, which at least rhetorically says that it's in favor of a two-state solution. And you have, in general, I would say, repressive but somewhat freer atmosphere for people to express their views, their political views, openly. And in East Jerusalem, again, it's a very different situation altogether from both of those places, because those Palestinians, although they strongly identify as Palestinians, are in everyday close contact with Israel and with Israelis, and actually take advantage of many special benefits that none of the other Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza enjoy. They are free to work in Israel. They are free to travel in Israel or through Israel to other places. They are part of Israel's pretty extensive network of social welfare benefits, including medical insurance, unemployment benefits, retirement pensions, and on and on and on. And they are considered by Israel to be permanent residents because they live in Jerusalem, which the Israelis consider part of Israel. So they're Palestinians, but they're also not, in a sense, under occupation, or they're not isolated from Israel the way the West Bankers or the Gazans are. Now, how does that affect all of their attitudes? Well, what you can see if you look carefully and you don't lump them all together, and you can see that their attitudes are actually different in some very interesting and unexpected ways. And the one most unexpected finding, I would say, in that regard is that the people in Gaza on many different issues are actually more moderate toward Israel than the people in the West Bank. it's precisely because they live under Hamas rule that they actually have turned against that very uncompromising, belligerent attitude toward Israel and Israelis, because they can see in their own daily lives and in their experiences of war every few years, or major military skirmishes on the border with Israel, they can see how bad it is to go on fighting Israel forever, and how much better it might be for them if they actually could restore some form of ceasefire with Israel, and just for peace and quiet, and some form of economic cooperation with Israel, just in order to improve their standard of living, because they really do live in pretty dire straits in Gaza, and to make significant political concessions for the sake of someday of peace with Israel, or at least coexistence with Israel. And so the people in Gaza who have a reputation unfairly, I think, for being fundamentalists or extremists or militants or all of that, no, that's their government. That's not the
really
people.
Astounding to read it.
Right, that's not the people in Gaza. If you ask the people in Gaza, do you want to have economic cooperation with Israel? Always, a solid majority say yes. We don't want to boycott Israel. We want jobs in Israel. We want Israeli investment in Gaza. We want trade with Israel. We want all of the day-to-day improvements in our pretty bad situation that could come from that kind of cooperation with Israel. That's what the people in Gaza want, more so than the ones in the West Bank, by about 20 points, typically, in the most recent surveys. And if you ask the people in Gaza, do you want a ceasefire with Israel? They will, 60% again will say yes. We don't want Hamas to fire rockets at Israel. We don't want Hamas to have violent protests against Israel on the border that invite Israeli retaliation against us. And the people in the West Bank, who are far away from that and who won't suffer the consequences, they typically say, yeah, sure, let's fire rockets at Israel, but from someplace else, from Gaza, or let's have violent protests against Israel, but on the border with Gaza, not here in the West Bank, because it doesn't affect them so directly.
Yeah.
And there are many other issues that fall into that same category. Now I want to say one thing about the people in East Jerusalem, all right?
Please.
Who are, as I said, a special case. And what these polls show, and this was really, really surprising to a lot of people back in 2010 until 2015. What the surveys showed, if you break out the East Jerusalem Palestinians separately, and I was the first one who did that, they showed that actually majority, as of 2015, of those Palestinians said that they would prefer to be citizens of Israel rather than of a Palestinian state if they had to make that choice. Even though they were Palestinians and they feel strongly about that, just for practical reasons, they would have back then, until about 5 years ago, preferred to be Israeli citizens, with all of the pragmatic benefits that that entailed for them. But in the last 5 years, that attitude has shifted very, very sharply. And so today, Palestinians in East Jerusalem no longer feel that way. They're actually, unfortunately, quite alienated from and angry at Israel, and they've come to resemble much more than they used to in their attitudes their cousins on the West Bank or in Gaza.
It really is, and for those who have not read the study, I'll plug it again.
Yeah, sure.
It is really interesting to see how the experiential element of life shapes people's public opinion.
Right.
So David, I want to take us in another direction and take the liberty of asking the $1 million question that I imagine many of our listeners would want to know. So one of the central findings that you found for Palestinians across Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem was that today, backing for a two-state solution has actually become the minority view.
That's right. Yeah.
So as an organization, we at AJC are strong advocates of a two-state solution. Most recently, Jason Isaacson, our chief policy officer, put out a statement, again, very timely with today's events, acknowledging the danger of potential annexation and how it could imperil efforts towards a negotiated effort. So a two-state solution, of course, hinges on a willingness from both sides. So in your findings, what can you tell us about a perceived prospect of a two-state solution?
Okay, so really, again, thanks for that great question. You're absolutely right. The surveys show very clearly, and it's not just my surveys or the Palestinian pollsters that I work with who come up with these numbers. It's other Palestinian pollsters in recent years too, who confirm that overall the Palestinian public, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza or in East Jerusalem, has drifted away from preferring a two-state solution over other possible options. And there are two aspects to that that are worth mentioning. One is that and here again, I'm talking about not every single one, we're talking about percentages here, right? So it's about 60% of the Palestinians in all of those territories today reject a two-state solution in favor of other options. What are those other options? Those other options are a small minority, like about 10% typically, maybe sometimes up to 15%, say that they want a one-state solution, as we often define it, meaning a country in which Arabs and Jews and Israelis would live together on equal terms, kind of a binational state or something like that, a one-state solution. That is a small minority of the Palestinian public, contrary to what some people like to think, that this might be the answer because, you know, maybe people have given up on a two-state solution, so maybe this is a better idea. Well, the fact is that maybe some people in Washington or in other places far, far away think that, but that's not what the Palestinians think. And it's not what the Israelis think either. So if they don't want it, it's hard to imagine how that would actually work as a good idea if people on the ground don't want it. That's the one-state solution. Then about 10 or 15% of the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza say, well, we would rather start to think differently about this and maybe talk about a confederation with Egypt or with Jordan, in which the Palestinians would have local self-government or autonomy or something like that, not under Israeli rule, but maybe connected with the neighboring Arab country. That's kind of surprising because many people thought that that was an option that is just obsolete. You know, it's too late historically to talk about that. But it turns out that there still is a minority, not a large proportion, but a minority of Palestinians who are coming back to that idea. And then what you have is a plurality of the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem. And I'm sorry to say this, but this is what the numbers show us, who today say, no, I don't want a two-state solution. I want to take over all of Palestine. I want the Palestinians to take over Israel. Not to live together with Israelis, but to take over Israel for the Palestinians and get rid of Israel. It turns out that today, that is the plurality view, not a majority, but that's the plurality, 45% typically, or something like that, of the Palestinian public that is inclined to pursue that option. So that's the first thing to say about it. The second thing to say about it, and this is equally, I think, important to keep in mind, even though a lot of people don't keep it in mind, is that these polls change over time. And Palestinian public opinion was at one time in favor of a two-state solution, in favor of peace with Israel, in favor of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, not taking over Israel for the Palestinians. That was true until not that many years ago, around 5 years ago or so. And so Palestinian public opinion is not static. It changes depending on the circumstances, depending on people's expectations, depending on whether they see any realistic prospect of progress toward a two-state solution or not. And for example, so if Palestinian public opinion changed in this, what I would call negative or hostile direction toward Israel, and it has, there's no getting away from that, in the last 5 years or so, then conceivably under different circumstances, it could change back again in a more positive or moderate or peaceful direction.
So to kind of take us to a stage that is hopeful and also future looking.
Right.
I want to talk a bit about short-term roles compared to long-term and also demographic.
Right.
So here, our call today, we have access leaders who represent the now generation of young Americans, right?
Okay.
In your research, you found that our counterparts, so younger Palestinians, actually really had more of a short-term pragmatism.
That's right.
Than the older generation, the willingness to have that personal contact with Israelis, more open mind, I believe it was to President Trump's peace plan in the short term, but in the long term, they were more equally aligned with older generations about a resistance or maybe caution about permanent peace. So based on your findings, do you think there are steps in the short term that younger generation, that can be taken with younger generation to help in develop a greater longer term acceptance to a permanent Israeli policy?
That's another great question, and I think you're absolutely right again that in your summary of the findings, and then to take it to the next step. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I would say that if people find ways to build on this pragmatism, short-term pragmatism, tactical, if you want to call it that, pragmatism especially among the Palestinian younger generation, those under 30, and half the population is under 30. It's a very young population, or more than half the population is under 30. Half of the adult population is under 30. In other words, between 18 and 30, right? That's half the sample and half of the adult population of Palestinians in these areas. So those people are especially open to economic cooperation with Israel. They're especially open to dialogue with Israelis and other people who are interested in these issues on the outside, even if their opinions differ. They're especially open to compromises on issues like the right of return for Palestinian refugees or recognition of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people. They're especially open to what I would call at least, let's say, temporary or short-term peaceful coexistence with Israel rather than terrorism or violence or intifada or anything like that. So all of those positions held by the younger generation are significantly more moderate, more hopeful, more flexible and constructive than the official positions of the Palestinian political leadership. Even the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority political leadership in Ramallah, takes much harder line positions on all of those kinds of issues than its own younger generation. And the way I think to work with that and to build on it is to find ways to get Israelis and Palestinians working together on actual pragmatic projects, not so much, I would say dialogue for the sake of dialogue, but for example, right now, to get them working together against coronavirus, to get them working together on high-tech entrepreneurship for Palestinians, working with Israel's terrific high-tech industry, and to get them working together on things like, simple things like providing services for translation of Arabic and Hebrew and English, which all of these populations are very good at, and there's a demand for it, and it can be done remotely to a great extent. And actually, all of these things are being done, but they're being done on a pretty small scale. And there's a great opportunity to open up that horizon for both sides in a way that I would predict, based on the long-term survey trends that I've researched and documented, I would predict that if there's more of that short-term cooperation, then attitudes about long-term issues will also improve gradually. And the younger generation, if it has these opportunities, will move toward going back to acceptance of a two-state solution as the end of the conflict, not just as a slogan, right, to get what you want and then keep fighting for the whole thing, right, for all of Palestine, but to accept that as the end of the conflict with Israel. And that hasn't happened yet. And I would say two other quick things about this before and I think probably it's almost time to take some questions, which I'm very happy to do. Two other quick things about that. One is that there's also an opportunity for Palestinians and Israeli Arabs, the Arab citizens of Israel, 20% of the population, who have become much more integrated into Israeli politics, Israeli society, Israeli education, the Israeli economy, including the high-tech sector in recent years. There's an opportunity that was not there previously, I think, for that community, which is today almost 2 million people, to be a bridge between Israel and the Palestinians, and between the Palestinians and the Jewish majority of the Israeli population. So there's a lot of good work that could be done with that, and some of that is being done. You have Israeli Arab doctors who are helping Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, where Israelis are not free to go. Jewish Israelis are not free to go, but Arab Israelis are. You have companies that are starting to work together on high-tech projects that include Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis, Muslim and Christian, and Palestinians, and all of that could and should be increased greatly, I think, in scope and impact in the future. The second point to make, and this relates directly, and I'll stop with this, to today's news about Israel and the United Arab Emirates, is, and this is very hopeful in the larger sense, is that what the same polls that I do among Palestinians, I do among other Arabs in Egypt, in Jordan, in the United Arab Emirates, even in Saudi Arabia. And what I find increasingly in the last 5 years is that the public, I'm not talking now about the government or the elite, right? But the people, the street level, ordinary people in those countries are increasingly receptive to the idea of peace with Israel and economic cooperation with Israel and ending the conflict once and for all. And at this point, the people in the outside Arab countries are actually more in favor of peace with Israel and a two-state solution as the end of the conflict than the Palestinians are. So it may be that we're at a point today, and this is literally what we are seeing today. It may be that it's those other Arabs that can lead the way to trying to encourage the Palestinians and the Israelis to compromise with each other They need that encouragement from the outside. And the people on the outside, I emphasize, not just the governments, are for it.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. And I would say within AJC, we are strong believers in the need for person-to-person engagement.
Absolutely.
I am going to take the liberty to ask one more question. A reminder to everyone listening, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on your screens. To touch on the topic you just brought up about this notion of kind of the elite versus street and this divide.
Yeah.
You found the same thing with which you mentioned, very much true within Palestinian society.
Absolutely.
That for many of the public's viewpoints, they are far more moderate, not nearly as extreme as those in Palestinian leadership.
Yeah,
the part that I think was really fascinating that you highlighted is that for the leadership, there's this kind of disregard for what Palestinian public opinion is. Policy is shaped not from what is happening on the street. So with that in mind, what do you think it means, or does it have any effect on the longevity of Fatah's existence and also the longevity of Hamas's existence?
Yeah, right.
All to answer within the next 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, yeah, sure. Look, again, your summary is excellent. That is what we see on a lot of issues, especially practical short-term issues. The public is more moderate than the leaders, certainly than Hamas, but also even compared with the Palestinian Authority, Abbas and company in Ramallah. And that's true not just about, really short-term issues, but also about important, very sensitive issues for Palestinians, like the right of return or recognizing Israel as a Jewish state or a homeland of the Jewish people. Those are things that the leadership considers absolutely, beyond the pale, like won't even talk about it. But the people actually, typically in most polls, a majority of the people would say, yeah, if that's what it would take to get us our own independent Palestinian state or end the occupation, yeah, we're willing to compromise on that issue. And the leadership just won't pay heed to that. So what does that mean? What can we do about it? What does it suggest about the stability of the political leadership? Unfortunately, my judgment is, and this goes beyond the polling data, this is more of a political judgment based on all my 40 plus years of experience in the region. I think the political leadership does pay some attention to public opinion because it has to, because otherwise there'd be, real trouble on the streets and a lot of discontent that would get in the way of their staying in power, or at least being able to govern effectively, relatively effectively. So they pay some attention to public opinion, but they're inclined not to pay a whole lot of attention to it. And I don't see that changing, unfortunately, either in Gaza or in the West Bank. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem have no real leadership. They're kind of in some weird limbo, without any local leadership. So they're, again, a special case. But in any case, public opinion is a small factor, I would say, in the leadership's, not trivial, but a small factor. And the proof of that is that if you ask the people in the West Bank, do you support Hamas? Typically only about 15% of the people in Gaza say they support their own government. But the government is still there. Why? Because there aren't any elections. There haven't been any elections in Palestine, in Gaza, or in the West Bank for 15 years, okay? And there's no prospect that there'll be an election anytime soon. So that's not the way to throw the bums out, right? Even though the people want to throw the bums out. In the West Bank, again, 2/3 of the people, year in and year out in recent years, say that Abbas should resign, that, you know, he's lost his legitimacy as the president of the Palestinian Authority. But he's not going to do that. You know, he's not going to pay attention to that. But here's where they do pay attention to public opinion. And this is something that we can all, I think, take some hope from, and also help, encourage, you know, to get even stronger. They do pay attention when the public says, we don't want an intifada. We don't want a violent uprising against Israel. The public doesn't want it, and in the West Bank. And so the leadership, even if they threaten that there will be an intifada, that, you know, if Israel does this or that, they don't want it because they know that their own people don't want it, and it could get out of control. Similarly in Gaza, when the people in Gaza, and I know that, that even Hamas reads my polls. I know they do. And so when they look at my polls, and the polls show that the people in Gaza wanted Hamas to stop all those violent mass protests on the fence, right, along the border fence with Israel. The people in Gaza said, no, we don't want that. And eventually Hamas said, okay, all right, we're going to stop that. And they did, because they know that they're not going to pay attention to their own public about a lot of things, but on some things that could really get out of control for them and backfire, blow up literally in their faces, they know that they need to pay some attention when the public is more moderate than the leaders and more inclined toward peaceful coexistence with Israel. So,
David, I just finding the time, I could actually, sure. I have more.
I can see we're up to 18 questions.
Are coming.
That's a lucky number. So why don't we break for questions right now? Go ahead.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Maggie. We're getting some really great questions in, and I will say that of the questions that are coming in, there are some that are similar to each other. So I think we'll do our best in combining some of them.
Sure.
So the question that has come up the most comes from one of your earlier points in this conversation, which is that you noticed a public shift between 2015 and 2020 in East Jerusalem. Yes. Can you share a little bit more about what your findings have determined as to that shift in East Jerusalem?
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that's, you know, if you want to read a lot about it, maybe more than you ever really wanted to know, you can just go to the Washington Institute website and look at, I discussed that in some detail in the actual report, or if you want, you can send your mailing address to our wonderful hosts, and we will be pleased to send you an actual hard copy of the full report with all of the beautiful charts and statistics and footnotes and everything in color and all of that. So that will answer the question in much more detail than I really have time to do now. But I'll just say this. What happened in late 2015, some of you may still remember it, was what has come to be known as the knife intifada, in which there was a sudden surge of violent terrorist, really, incidents by Palestinians in and around East Jerusalem against Israelis. Stabbings and car rammings and other arson and, you know, other really tragic incidents like that. And the Israelis reacted to it quite severely with all kinds of new security measures, like blocking off whole neighborhoods or doing house-to-house searches of suspected Palestinian agitators and increasing the arrests of Palestinians. And that created this kind of vicious circle of alienation and antagonism between the two populations that had really lessened quite a lot in earlier years. On top of that, you had an increase in religious tensions between Palestinians and Israelis in East Jerusalem, and specifically surrounding the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that strikes a very, very raw nerve among Palestinians. Palestinians, I have to say, based on the surveys, even though I don't believe it, and I think it's just factually wrong, but a lot of Palestinians, including a lot of the Palestinians, I mean, really a lot, like 85% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem believe that Israel is intent on somehow damaging the Al-Aqsa Mosque and working against Islam. And if they believe that, even though it isn't really true, then it's going to affect their attitudes in a very, very negative way. And then on top of those two things, right, the knife intifada, the religious tensions, there was an increase in outside agitation among the Palestinians in East Jerusalem against Israel. And that outside agitation was coming from Hamas, was coming from the extremist Islamic movement among Israeli Arabs called the Northern Branch of the Islamic movement, which is led by Sheikh Raad Salah, who is an imam that has been convicted of incitement to violence and terrorism by Israeli courts, and actually was very active in East Jerusalem in trying to stir up enmity toward Israel, and succeeded to some extent, unfortunately. And then another outside actor, and this is still going on, is Turkey, which I think, again, quite unfortunately, has taken upon itself the role of being a friend of Hamas and a friend of militant Palestinian nationalism and political Islam in East Jerusalem specifically. And because Turkey officially has diplomatic relations with Israel and sends lots of tourists and pilgrims to Israel, and because the Israeli Arabs, even the extremists among them, have free access to Jerusalem, they're able to operate there and stir up this kind of trouble. And that's exactly what they've been doing for the last 5 years. And then the fourth factor is more, I would say, an accidental one, which is that an increasing proportion of the East Jerusalem Palestinians live outside the wall, outside the security barrier that Israel set up. So even though they're technically and legally residents of Jerusalem, they still have to go through checkpoints, and they still have to put up with all of that delay and hassle and humiliation in order to enjoy the benefits of working and traveling in Israel that other East Jerusalem Palestinians have always enjoyed. So as that proportion rises of Palestinians outside the wall who are more frustrated because of just practical problems like that, then that is also going to turn the population as a whole more against Israel. And so what you saw was that in 2015, you actually had a majority, as I said, 52% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem who said that if they had to choose, they'd rather be Israeli citizens than Palestinian citizens. Today, that number is less than 20%. It's a really, really big change in a kind of a hostile, or at least not a positive direction. And those, I think, are the reasons why. But again, as I said before, if it changed once in a negative direction, it could change another time in a positive direction if the circumstances improve. And all of the things I just mentioned are subject to improvement if with a little bit of goodwill and a little bit of smart policy and maybe a little bit of encouragement from people like you.
Great, thank you, David. I think we may have time for one more question. I know
one more question.
I know there are so many questions and really amazing questions. So hopefully we will be able to create opportunities for future Q&A. But this one seems like a really timely question given the news of today. So we've had a few questions come in about today's historic normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel. So the questions coming in ask if, first, this is an indication that many of the Arab nations have tired of the stalemate between Palestine and Israel. And is this an opportunity to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, especially as there are potential options for the future with Bahrain and Oman? Do we see this as an opportunity to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority to engage with Israel?
Well, the short answer, which is, it's good that it's short because we're running out of time, to both of those very good questions, my short answer is yes. Yes, many people in many Arab countries have gotten tired, frustrated, impatient with the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict and with the Palestinians as well as the Israelis. And so for example, in the UAE, to be very specific, I did a poll there in June, and you can, by the way, you can read more about all of these survey results on my blog, which is called Fikra Forum, Fikra, Fikra, which is the Arabic word for idea. Fikra Forum, it's on the Washington Institute website, or just go to fikraforum.org. And you'll find all of these polls and the charts and everything else that goes with them. So in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, in June, I asked whether people thought that Palestinians and Israelis were both of them, both sides, were to blame for their continuing conflict, not just Israel. And a really high proportion of ordinary people, citizens of the UAE, 40%, almost half of the public said, yeah, I blame both the Palestinians and the Israelis, not just Israel. And that's a really, really important change from the way things were not so many years ago. And it's not just that the Palestinians have become kind of a stale issue for a lot of these other Arab publics, especially the ones in countries farther away from Israel and Palestine and the Gulf or other places. It's also that they have other much more urgent issues that they are thinking about. And they're thinking much more about internal issues, economic and political, and now health issues. And they're thinking about Iran. They're thinking about the civil war in Yemen, which is much closer and more dangerous for them than anything that's going on in Israel or Palestine. So it's not as high a priority for most people in those countries. That is not the case in countries closer to Israel, like Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon, countries actually bordering Israel, where the Palestinian issue is still number one for most people. But even there, people are starting to say, well, it's time for this to end. And we need to compromise. We need to get the Palestinians to stop saying no to everything and reach some kind of agreement, because it's gone on for far too long. That is where public attitudes have moved. If you ask people in Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or the other Gulf countries, if you ask whether they support a two-state solution, 60% at least say yes. If you ask whether they think Arab countries should give both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, more incentives to compromise, not pressure, but incentives to compromise with each other. Again, 60% of the ordinary people, man in the street and woman in the street, in all of those countries say yes, that we think that that's what you should do. If you ask them whether after there's some kind of a deal between Israel and the Palestinians, that it's a good thing for Arab countries to have normal relations with Israel, again, 60 or 70% say yes. And amazingly, if you ask, is it a good thing for some Arab states to have relations with Israel even before the Palestinian issue is resolved? In the most recent polls that were done late last year or early this year, again, you get 60 or 70% in the UAE or Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries saying yes. So the public is behind this in those countries. Now, what does that mean for putting pressure or somehow persuading the Palestinians to go back to the negotiating table and to compromise on some issues where they've refused to do that? Well, I have to say that the Palestinians have shown really an impressive ability to resist any kind of outside pressures of that kind, or outside inducements or incentives, actually, for a very long time, and especially in the last 20 years, since Israel made an offer at Camp David, and then again renewed the offer about a decade ago in 2008. to give the Palestinians an independent state in Gaza and 95% or something like that of the West Bank. And the Palestinians said no, and the Palestinian leadership at least said no. So I have to say that, unfortunately, but realistically, I'm not sure that this latest step between Israel and the UAE that was announced today is going to change the Palestinian political position. I think they are going to react very negatively, actually, at least in the beginning, and they already are showing signs of that. But, you know, eventually, then I do think that when more and more Palestinians, especially in the younger generation, and as the older leadership inevitably passes from the scene, as they come to realize that they are not going to get the kind of pan-Arab support that they used to think they could get, and that the Arabs are actually starting to move away from them and make friends with Israel regardless of what the Palestinians say or do, then eventually, someday, that will probably move the Palestinians toward a more realistic position on peace with Israel. It's just that in the short term, I am skeptical that we're going to see that happen anytime soon. So what we need, in my opinion, at least for this, is patience. We do. We need to take the long view, and the long-term trend clearly is for Arab countries to make peace with Israel. And, you know, Egypt did it 40-something years ago, Jordan did it 25 years ago, now the UAE is doing it literally today. And it may take, you know, some more years before the Palestinians follow suit. But I do want to say this, even the Palestinians, in the long-term historical view, have moved very far toward accepting the reality of Israel and even the idea of peace with Israel. Not Israel's right to exist or Israel's legitimacy or Israel's permanence. No, the Palestinians don't accept that, even today. But they do accept the necessity of a two-state solution, which is at least officially, right? At least half of them still, or roughly half of them still accept that at the popular level. And that marks actually, in a long sweep of history, I think a very significant positive change from the days when, in my lifetime, maybe not in your lifetime, when the Palestinians said, no, never, 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 no peace with Israel ever. No two-state solution. We want all of Palestine. Israel is the Zionist entity. There's no such thing as Israel. We will never accept it or recognize it. We want to go back to Haifa and Jaffa, and not just have an independent little Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. So compared to the way things were before the Oslo agreements, 25 or so years ago, actually the Palestinian position at both the official and the popular level has moved in the direction of compromise. The last point I want to make about that is that, unfortunately, however, we have to put a big asterisk next to that and say that is not the Hamas view. Okay, the Hamas view is and was, and I think forever will be, no peace with Israel, not ever, okay? And it's important, I think, especially now as we approach the possibility of changes in the American policy on this issue, it's important to keep in mind that there are some people who think that, well, we could reach a compromise with Hamas. And my answer to that is, well, maybe, but Hamas doesn't want to compromise.
Thank
so
you for
there's
that.
really no point in
Thank
trying
you
to
for
reach
that,
a compromise with somebody who doesn't want to do that.
Thank you so much for that perspective, David. And thank you,
bet.
Maggie. Thank you,
Yes.
Maggie, for moderating this conversation.
Thank
As
you.
we are at time, I really want
Right.
to thank both of you for this fascinating and really interesting conversation. I'm sure we have many questions, and we are more than happy to share the report after it goes out, after our session's over. We want to thank you for joining us. We'll hope you'll join us for future remote access and advocacy anywhere programs. Next week, you can join AJC for the first ever virtual Democratic and Republican National Conventions from August 17th through the 27th. You can register for these exciting events at ajc.org/conventions. If you like what you've heard today, please consider making a gift to AJC, information of which can be found on our homepage. Thank you and be well. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay.